capitalism's war on so many fronts. And the interesting thing was that there was also resistance. The art and aesthetics session had a great deal of evidence of the resistance, capitalism's war against nature, against people. Then we had the, the poetry session, then the just concluded session on Adivasis and Dalits. We have seen what capitalism has done. But capitalism also operates in the context of many other contradictions that we have seen, and how capitalism uses those contradictions, the other class contradictions, the caste, race, gender contradictions, that also we have seen. Therefore, this session, which is talking particularly the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the NATO aggressive expansion, and the war that has gone for 6 months and more, gone on, is part of that larger question. For over a century, we have been discussing what imperialism has done, how imperialism and capitalism thrive on war, militarism, and various kinds of aggressions. I will only add 2 thoughts to what Ritusha has said. One, capitalism uses nationalism of a particular tribe. First, it builds up nationalism as a monolithic and authoritarian type, and centralized, not decentralized, authoritarian, not democratic, monolithic, not pluralist. And that kind of nationalism we are right now seeing in India, for example, in Russia, in so many other places. Is the Ukraine situation also an illustration of that? So imperialism, capitalism, and nationalism in the context of war. The second, how bitterly we see today, unfortunately, the absence of peace forces in the world. The Bandung legacy, and many of us are part of the Bandung network, Bandung Spirit Network, and the anti-imperialist forces had generated structures and movements for peace. And the nuclear disarmament, I'm so glad Achin is here. He has been our really the beacon of the Indian anti-nuclear campaign. We have lost one, Dr. Bidwai, we remember. And today we lack the moral political forces, either the Bertrand Russell, that kind of force, even Noam Chomsky didn't rise to this occasion as a organized political initiative. We have seen United Nations ceasing to play that role. The small role that it has played is important in refugee sector and facilitating the grain exports and so on, but not in the peace initiative. And so what has produced the discourse on militarism, war, balance of power, realist theory, neorealism dominating the whole discourse in all countries. In that context, this discussion becomes extremely important. And if we have to generate forces of peace, not only to end, and just recently the Test Ban Treaty renewal, could not be done. There was a deadlock. I'm sure there will be more discussion on these points, but this discussion is extremely important for the creative theory movement for democratic transformation of the world. With these words, may I invite my friend, colleague, Achin Binayak.
Thank you very much, Manu, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak on the subject. And obviously, capitalism has been connected to all kinds of wars. If you look at what capitalism to function, there are three aspects of capitalism's functioning domestically or internationally. One, its necessity to expand all the time, its area of operation. Second, intrinsic to it is its competition. And third is the question of stabilization. Competition is intrinsic to capitalism, but stabilization and coordination is not. And that stabilization has to come domestically from states, globally from the system of states, because capitalism operates within the system of states. I'm sorry, there's some. Can you hear me? Yeah, sorry, because I'm messing. All right. So anyway, now historically, you had capitalism associated with colonization, brutal wars against indigenous peoples, and you've also had, of course, inter-imperialist rivalries, which have resulted in wars, the First World War. The formation of the Soviet Union in 1917 meant that you had to have imperialism, then trying to crush this first break, if you like, from the capitalist order. And later on, during the Second World War, you again had inter-imperialist rivalry, but you also had two other kinds of wars which were there involved in the Second World War. And those two were, of course, on one hand, the struggle by countries that have been occupied by Japan, Germany, Italy, mass opposition of a democratic kind against the dictatorships of these particular countries, a positive dimension. And many of these struggles were in fact led by communist forces, or in which they were predominant. And therefore, as a result of this, you had at the end of the Second World War, you had, for example, breakthroughs in Korea, in China, in Albania, and in Yugoslavia, out of the capitalist system, at least for a certain period of time. And the third aspect of that Second World War was a conflict between Germany and the one country which was not capitalist, the Soviet Union. And at the end of the war, you had two basic victors, the United States of America and the Soviet Union, which was, of course, much more weakened, even as it expanded its control over Eastern Europe. Now, the interesting thing after the Second World War is that you don't, during the Cold War period, from, say, 1945 till 1990, is that you don't have inter-imperialist rivalries ending in wars like you had in the First and Second World War. And the main reason was this was not Kautsky's ultra-imperialism so much, but a kind of super-imperialism where the European capitalist imperialist powers accepted the political and military subordination to the United States of America. And therefore, what you had, if you like, during this particular period of the Cold War was a systemic conflict between East and West, which also provided the background for a series of struggles for decolonization and national liberation independence that took place. And of course, in some cases, they met again with tensions from the United States, in particular, supported by other allies here. So you had this kind of a development, but you had the eventual success of the decolonization movement by the mid-70s and so on. You also had, after the end of the Second World War, because of wartime mobilization and the existence of this systemic difference, you also had a move in the advanced countries towards a much more strong social democratic welfare capitalism. And you had the attempt in what was called the Third World for a kind of developmentalist, capitalist developmentalism, even if it is given the name of socialism, which didn't really succeed apart from a few countries, exceptions in Southeast Asia for specific reasons. Yeah. You had this here, but by the late 70s, you find a shift towards what's been called neoliberal capitalist globalization, especially after the Soviet noise coming in. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Just a minute. Just a minute.
Carry on, carry on.
Muted.
Muted. Remove it.
Okay.
There is some outsider.
Yeah.
Yes. It's kind of attack.
Please,
Yeah.
please carry on.
Okay, yeah. So what happened, of course, is that you had the emergence of a neoliberal capitalist globalization, which took place, accelerated after the 1990s here. The collapse of Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, China shift. This shift towards capitalism did not come primarily in these countries because of pressure from below. It came because the ruling elites in these countries decided that their shift to capitalism would be the best way for them to advance themselves. But in the case of the Soviet Union, its breakup, and the case of Yugoslavia's breakup, this was accompanied by nationalist irredentism, and therefore wars in these particular areas as well. The Soviet Russia, of course, with its wars in the near abroad, various places, Georgia, so on, elsewhere, Chechnya, and so on, and also in the Balkans here. And what do you find? You find that, in fact, another development that took place after the after the collapse or end of the Cold War was the unification of Germany. And Germany, already an economic powerhouse with much stronger influence, for example, on the former East European countries of the Soviet bloc, was also flexing its political and military muscles. I say this because, in fact, the US intervention in the Balkans behind the UN was not simply directed towards sending a message to Russia, but also to a certain extent towards Germany. And what you find after the end of the Cold War period is still this continuing basic political military subordination of the European capitalist imperialist countries to the United States of America, even as the United States declining. But what about the relationship with the United States of America, China, and Russia, which are in fact capitalist countries? And contrary to what some on the left think, they are also imperialist countries over here. Here, this very interesting was development. It's not as if there was a huge clash. In fact, Russia and China in the beginning were seeking to accommodate themselves and work with, in partnership with the United States of America. So you have a very ugly history of the Americans and the West supporting the ugliness of Russia and Chechnya and elsewhere. And you also have the history of the Chinese and the Russians supporting the American behavior, for example, in the Middle East, Libya, Iraq, and so on. But of course, as imperialist countries, they also want their own spheres of influence. And the difference between the ruling classes of capitalist Russia and China, as distinct from Western Europe, is that the history of their development as ruling elites and all is one in which they were much more independent and even had to oppose the United States. And therefore, the problem, if you like, was that you would have a problem for the United States in its effort to establish a kind of global order in which capitalism can prosper as they think best. Russia and China were not prepared to accept the kind of terms that the United States would seek to establish. So look at the relationship, for example, between the United States and China. In the beginning, after the end of the Cold War, a partnership. Then a competition, strategic competitor. Then China as a rival. And now China as an opponent and a possible enemy. So you have, in fact, this movement towards that. And this kind of tension that is there, which is reflected, of course, in the Ukraine crisis. But the Ukraine crisis is not simply a question of a reaction to the question of NATO, anything like that. Big imperialist powers or aspiring imperialist powers all love to talk the language of national security, of legitimate national security. But they want what they call spheres of influence. And spheres of influence is basically a euphemism justified by both liberals and the forces like in Russia elsewhere, unfortunately, even sometimes on the left, as a kind of justification for your imperial direct or indirect domination over weaker powers of various kinds over here. if you recognize that what has happened in Ukraine is not simply concerning the legitimate national security of Russia, but is in fact related to its legitimate security ambitions. Unfortunately, if you say legitimate security ambitions, legitimate ambitions don't go together. Whereas, of course, national security, it goes much more comfortably. And they made it very, very clear, and they want their own here. So even as Russia would have accepted going into, and even Putin, not just Yeltsin, but talked about China, USA being part of NATO, whatever. They let NATO come into the Balkans region, but Russia wants its own sphere of influence, the North Caucasus, etc., the CSTO, all of that over there. And it's not just Russia or China, of which are much weaker imperialist powers than the United States and elsewhere, but there are also countries like Turkey, like Saudi Arabia, like India, like Pakistan, which are also having their own imperial ambitions, which are, of course, rationalized in the name of sphere of influence. Their justification for bullying their own neighbors and also carrying out attacks and also making all kinds of connections over here. Now, this is all very, very worrying because, sorry, what happened here?
No, carry on, carry on.
Sorry, hello, what happened?
Yeah, carry on, please carry on.
Yeah. So what has also happened over I lost my train of thought. Yeah, what's also happened over here is that the problem is that none of these countries are able to stabilize the global order for the adequate functioning of capitalism. Plus, capitalism itself has gone through different phases. And today we're in the phase of a kind of neoliberal capitalist globalization, which is the most right-wing form of even capitalist development here, different from the earlier Keynesianism here. And this right-wing shift in capital accumulation, in the regime of capital accumulation, can only be stabilized if there is a corresponding right-wing shift in ideology and politics, which must take place at the nationally specific level, because in fact what you have are this neoliberal globalization operating in a system of multiple nation states. Many people talk about a transnational capitalist class. I don't agree. You do not have, you do not have multinational corporations, you have transnational corporations. That is to say, which operate globally, but have their home bases in particular countries. And in competition, if they're losing out, they don't just accept it and say, let the market prevail. They want their states to protect them. And therefore, you have American transnational corporations, Dutch, Indian, Portuguese, British, French, all these kinds of corporations here. They're not truly multinationally owned at all. They're related here. And therefore, these tensions that exist between the states continues. And today you have 5 huge problems created by capitalism. And this is the future. And in fact, these are problems nationally and internationally. What are these problems? And they are the absolutely crucial ones. Number one, we see the extraordinary situation of the enormous inequality of income and wealth within and between countries, even as you have 1.5 to 2 billion people who are suffering from malnutrition and undernourishment. I'm not talking about basic needs, education, social security, pensions. No, I'm talking about malnourishment and undernourishment. The contrast between capitalism and pre-capitalist societies are their economic crisis and problems were those of underproduction. Today, you have a crisis of overproduction, when in fact, nobody needs to stop. This is extraordinary. And it's getting worse. Second, you have a situation, like I said, because of the rightward shift, the point that Professor Mohanty mentioned here, and that is that you've had a shift towards an authoritarian nationalism, which takes place in nationally specific ways. The rise of right-wing populism of various kinds and authoritarian right-wing nationalisms. Yeah. Only in a few places have you had left-wing populism, Latin America and so on. But much more has been the spread of that, connected to the need to justify and sustain neoliberal capitalism here. And therefore, you've had the politics of cultural exclusivism emerging with that in 4 different forms: ethnicity, race, religion, nation, either separately or usually in combination, authoritarian nationalisms. That's another problem. And this has meant that democracy, after the end of the Cold War, to some extent procedurally spread. But like spreading butter on a toast, what has happened is that everywhere it has thinned dramatically. We're talking about surveillance capitalism everywhere. India, West and all, it's become much worse. So this is the second dimension that we're talking about over here, connected to capitalism. Then there is the pandemics that have emerged after the turn of the millennium in 21,000. Yeah. What is this due to? This is due, one, the distance between human habitation and wildlife, the desperate search for more and more capital accumulation, etc., has narrowed. You have the industrialization of agricultural production, in particular the industrialization of livestock production in so many ways, which has created huge problems here. You have massive migration at different levels, internally within countries, to neighboring countries, and of course, from the south to the north. In each case, border patrols to regulate it, etc. But urban migration is taking place. In the global south, you have urbanization, which includes massive global slums, huge, massive slums of various kinds, and you have global tourism. This too is also a huge problem connected to the changed character of capitalism. And then you have two more problems. And these two are unique in the sense that for the first time in human history, you have a threat to the very existence in large part or whole of the human species itself, coming through global, to ecological devastation, and of course, the nuclear question. Let's take ecological devastation here. It's an extraordinary situation over here. And this is intimately connected, in my view, to capitalism. Yes, we talk about reforms, New Deal and all that here. But Kenneth Boulding, an ecological economist in the 1950s, because let's understand, what is the strength of capitalism? The strength of capitalism, the dynamism of capitalism comes from the constant pursuit of profits. But the constant pursuit of profits can only take place with the constant pursuit of growth. And Kenneth Boulding, an ecological economist of the 1950s, said, to believe that you can have infinite growth in a finite world, you have to be either a fool or an economist. And he's absolutely right. And you still have economists talking about the necessity to do that. They talk about reform of capitalism. But this is a central problem here. You know what we have today, ecologically speaking? We have the privatization of the commons, which should be the common heritage of humankind. Just two examples. Through carbon trading and offsetting, you're having the privatization of the atmosphere, which is not reducing overall carbon emissions, but is shifting the responsibility and the adjustments towards it. It's a disastrous situation. But of course, because we are all concerned about national interests and country, who cares about the fact that the islands, some small island states will be finished because we're going to cross 1.5 degrees away. Let me point out that since 1982 and this disgraceful establishment of exclusive economic zones, what you have is the privatization of the oceans and the seas. And today, 40% by surface area, not by volume, but 40% by surface area of the oceans and seas have been privatized. And you have exclusive economic zones, which to some extent overlap with each other, which create tensions and potential for wars as well. And this is the kind of situation with the continuity of capitalism that's taking place over here. And lastly, of course, the nuclear question. And the nuclear question is a disgrace. After coming down, it's now moving up. You have 9 countries that have it here. And they seem determined to carry on with this and to rationalize and justify their particular rivalries. Even within all these countries being capitalist, there are also not just economic, but other factors, historical and other political factors, which create tensions between them, and they seek to ratify. And what is the response of the nuclear powers towards this? Well, they divide themselves into good nuclear powers and the bad nuclear powers. So in the case of the Indians, they're saying, oh, Pakistan and China are the nuclear baddies. We, the Indians, are the nuclear goodies. And you keep quiet about the United States, which is the worst of the nuclear baddies because it's an ally. And in fact, with regard to the question of nuclear potential, possible nuclear outbreaks and so on, we've been very lucky. I don't want to go into the history, but perhaps the most dangerous area is, in fact, South Asia, where you have 2 countries. Both of them have nuclear weapons, but unlike elsewhere, they have a continuous history since their formation as independent states of hot-cold war. And the real danger of a nuclear attack emerging really comes from a situation in which there is conventional conflict. India and 2 territorially contiguous countries. They have fought 4 wars in a context of conventional war when both sides decide that they don't want to use nuclear weapons, But as the escalation dynamic of that war takes place, both sides have to start thinking that maybe we have to use it because the other side may use it and so on. And incidentally, this was something that happened in 1999 in the Kargil conflict, when both sides actually prepared the nuclear weapons for possible use. And here was one occasion when the US actually stopped.
Another 3 minutes?
Yeah, 3 minutes. So basically, this is the kind of situation that you have here. You have rivalries of various kinds between imperialist countries and aspiring imperialist countries. In the case of Ukraine and elsewhere, do not make them, Ukraine is a capitalist country, it's not an imperialist country. But you also have the situation where it's very dangerous to take sides with the lesser evil or the lesser imperialist country versus the others. You have to recognize that if we really want to move towards a much more humane order, we have to oppose all of them. And insofar as we are nationally situated, we have a particular responsibility against our own. At least those left in the advanced countries in West rightly criticize NATO and so on here. But how many of us in India have criticized the Indian government with regard to that over here on Ukraine, other matters as well here? So this, of course, is one very important issue here. How do we make a breakthrough? Because these problems that I pointed out, these 5 evils, are international in character. We have to start at the national level and hope that we can move towards international cooperation, but how? To me, the only way is if there is some kind of an anti-capitalist breakthrough in one of the advanced capitalist countries or one of the larger countries elsewhere, which could have a ripple effect, a dynamic impact. Because let me say that in the future, the problems that are emerging are so serious that you're going to have mass opposition and unrest, but there's no guarantee that they will succeed. In fact, a problem for us is that capitalism, to go beyond capitalism for all these reasons, is absolutely necessary, even as it seems more difficult. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Achin. Those 5 problems, particularly the last 2, are not only most scary, but also they challenge us to really take initiatives. Thank you so much. Now, may I request Anu? Hello. Anuradha Chinoy?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Mohanty. It is indeed a delight and an honor to be here. But I always feel, since Achin is, always provides me personally and such a wonderful framework, that it's such a tall order really to speak after him, because I generally agree with most of what he says. But there are very few voices, in fact, like Achin's, and his views are not reflected in narratives and in media, sadly. So it is indeed wonderful that he spoke and he provided this framework. But what I'm going to do really is speak on this current war, because it is one of the most dangerous wars to happen. And all the 5 threats that he spoke of, the fact is that all of them are accelerated on account of this war, and we need to find a solution for it. We need to have some kind of breakthrough of peace before it is too late. This Ukraine war, of course, is an illegal aggression by Russia. But in order to be able to even have some kind of peace movement towards or some resolution, we must realize and look at the prehistory to this aggression, because without that, no solution would be possible. And most of the global South actually, I think, see it. And the narrative in the global South is much more accurate than that which is coming from the West. Now, I believe this prehistory shows some distinct trends. Of course, as Achin said, the Cold War, the first Cold War, ended with the dismantling of the Soviet Union in 1991. But my other argument attached to that is that only the Russian side dismantled Cold War structures and institutions. The West they gained the peace, they had a triumphalism, and they retained all Cold War institutions and militarisms intact. In fact, NATO kept expanding. There were no disarmament measures since the INF. And with Gorbachev's death, many of these facts came out that while Russia kept looking to the West for revival and for building their capitalism, they continued to be humiliated and NATO kept expanding. Right since 1991, they had just one demand, and that was to limit this expansion and ultimately limit this expansion only to Ukraine. The current CIA director has even said this in his recent memoirs. Second, China was a partner in the globalization. Again, I agree with Achin. And it had great benefits where it transformed layers of its colonialism. It talks about itself still as a part of the global South. And it started building institutions to contest the US. So they had a second détente with the US after the one in 1972. And now they are a competitor and a threat. But in the global South, in these last 30 years, from 1990 till currently, there were three major trends. The first were the US and NATO aggressions, where just in the last 20 years, over 1 million just Iraqis were killed, then aggressions in Lebanon, Libya, Afghanistan, Yemen, etc. All an extension of capitalist, imperialism, militarism, etc., where President Obama alone dropped 20,000 bombs in 2016 alone. And yet the South was shown to be one as unable to live in peace. The second trend in the South was a rise of those so-called emerging economies, where they have trillions of state wealth in US treasuries. The World Bank argues that China has contributed 30% to global growth and building some institutions like BRICS, etc., in which they want to at least be equal partners within global capitalism, but those demands have been repeatedly rejected. And the third trend in the South was, of course, the rise of ethnic majoritarian regimes, anti-minorityism of the worst kind, the hollowing out of democracies, where some of these emerging countries, including India, China, Brazil, South Africa, are regional hegemons. But I wouldn't call them imperialist in the same way. They have internal colonization, but I wouldn't call them imperialist like Achin does. Now, so what happens in 2022 after these 30 years of peace, at least for Europe, except for the Bosnian conflict? I think there are three major conjunctures. First, the US under Biden shifted the direction for, again, a major global primacy. Till 2019, China was only seen as hampering and an upcoming opponent, Russia as a regional power, and NATO as an economic burden. All this shifted because of US's own internal issues and a belief that the neocon agenda is something that the Democrats should actually take over. And you can see this consistently in their strategic documents, where only before Russia's taking, sort of aggression, just before that, Biden has a strategic guidance document prevailing over China at any cost, and taking over primacy over land, sea, cyberspace, and everything in between. The second conjuncture was the decision by Russia and the deep state under Putin that red lines had been crossed, that the civil war in Ukraine for the last 7 years, the regime change, etc., would come into their borders, and they could not tolerate NATO missiles on their borders, just like I think no other countries, socialist, anti-capitalist, would have. So that was the second conjuncture. And therefore, this policy, the aggression of Russia on Ukraine actually fitted like a glove for Biden's strategy. And it has been willing to sacrifice Ukraine for the goal of decimating Russia, containing China, getting NATO behind it, and disciplining the global South again for all its faults. So that is how Biden announced America is back. Now, as far as the current status is concerned, I kind of agree with what Richard Falk, Phyllis Bennis, and others who talk about two simultaneous wars. One, the hot war in ground zero in Ukraine, and second, the larger geopolitical war. And I believe that, even as we share Achin's framework, we must understand these realist, neorealist conflicts in order to contest them, because this now is a hybrid war for control, and it is driven not by Western values as it's talked about an alliance of democracies, but it is about Western interests. And these are much more dominant and dangerous than the values or interests of the other authoritarian countries or sub-imperialists or whatever you want to call them. Because it reminds me, for example, of what my teacher Bipin Chandra used to say about majority communalism and minority communalism, which we challenged at that time. When we said they're both equally terrible, but he said, no, we have to fight majority communalism first. So this is something similar. This Western expansionism is extremely dangerous, and actually it is the only militarist alliance. Russia and China are strategic allies to a sense, but they have no military alliance. They have competitions and they have rivalries. And Russia is only 1/10 of China's, that is 1.6 trillion to China's 16.6 trillion. So it's really, it's a very small power. So even if this war is presented as inter-imperialist, we cannot present Russia and China as equal threats or the global South as a threat. This rivalry is highly asymmetric, and we need to really have a good critique of NATO. Because, for example, China, since 1980, the US has been in 15 overseas wars of choice, China in none, Russia in 1. US continues to have 85 military bases, and so on and so forth. So just now to understand what is happening in the global South, because as Professor Mohanty mentioned, it was a force during the First Cold War where non-aligned movement was built, even though it was much weaker in the whole ambit of capitalism than it is now. It is much stronger, but it has largely opted for neutrality. A minority, about 7 or 8, have been bandwagoning with the West. But the majority, if you see, aside from the initial, of course, everyone condemned war, whether they voted or abstained in the Security Council and United Nations. But nonetheless, they have all opposed unilateral sanctions. And the narrative over there talks exactly about what Achin said, where they say that Russia has legitimate security interests. And I've seen this in the papers of the ASEAN countries, in Latin America, in Africa, where all of them have said that we oppose this war, there should be diplomatic negotiations, but Russia's interest should also be secured. We do not want to see it decimated as the West is trying to do, and they see this as a proxy war. Now, just to give an example of this, I suppose my time is coming to an end, is about Africa, because that is such a clear case of the revival of neocolonialism, whether it's Francophone Africa or others, even if you want to decontinentalize Africa to understand it. But nonetheless, the US is just not tolerating what is happening in Africa today. Their focus is the fact that 25 out of Africa's 54 countries did not support the March resolution in the UN General Assembly. And now all of them have opposed the sanctions, even though they don't matter in the sanctions regime because their trade is so limited. The US recently passed 2 acts in Congress, and you should look at those. One is the China Chip Act, which is a beginning of sanctions and things like CATSA on China. And the second is called, which is passed in the US Congress, is called the Countering Malign Russian Activities and Russia Act Bill, which actually advocates pressurizing, monitoring, and punishing African states and leaders who engage with Russia. Now, in response to this, when Blinken was in South Africa just 10 days ago, the South African Foreign Minister, Naledi Pandor, she said in the same press conference where Blinken was present that no African countries should be bullied. She described this US bill as offensive legislation. And she said, she specifically pointed to several European leaders who had come and tried to push African countries out of neutrality to one or the other side. And she said, and I say all these are in quotes, that African countries that wish to relate to China, let them do so, whatever the particular form of relationship would be. And she reminded US of the plight of people who lived under apartheid in Palestine. So I think the immediate questions are what she raised. And at the same time, the US ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield, she threatened African nations that if they bought Russian oil or commodities, they would face sanctions. And the Macky Sall and others, Macky Sall, who is the director of the African Union, called this Cold War-esque. In the meantime, China is waiving 23 interest-free loans to 17 countries, as they did so in earlier in 2010, just as India did so in 2003. So what I'm arguing is there are different levels of intercapitalist rivalry, and the US actually is the main pusher of imperialism, militarism, and aggression. The sad part is that the global South has no single institution to represent their views. This neutrality is not non-alignment. It is just transacting between, hoping to get the best from the West and from China and from Russia or whoever they can to survive for regime stability. Because most of them are authoritarian capitalist regimes, as Achin said. I agree with that.
Another 3 minutes.
Yeah, I'm done. The other thing is that the military-industrial complexes, how they continue to gain. And I'm giving this analysis of just last week of the Orlan drones that Russia makes 1,000 of in a year and continues to make them, and they're a weapon of choice in this war. Now, if you see these drones, the engine is Japanese, The communications are German. The GPS is Swiss, and flight control sensors are American. So the military industrial complex continues to work in this war. And of course, there are the flashpoints in the global south, which can link with any kind of nuclear war or an escalation. So this is how it goes. And I agree with Achin's conclusion, so I won't say it about the 5 major problems. We are staring at an existential crisis for the planet, and this war is a war against the planet, and we should all find ways and keep writing of finding out how to end it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was a perfect compliment to Achin's presentation, and particularly highlighting, the way we should assess the American aggressive role in this whole situation and not equate the sides, yet see the Russian invasion, as you called it, the illegal Russian aggression. And particularly your analysis of the global south and the role, the impact of the sanctions and how the global south has reacted to the sanctions has been very important. And the African response to the American pressure has been really very, very educative. Thank you very much. Well, we go to our third speaker, Professor Peter Edwin Janssen from Germany. Professor Janssen.
Yeah, thank you very much for this talks heading in front of me. So my guess on the war on the Ukraine will be another one like most of the last talks, because I think we are standing in the middle here of the war, and some views of our interpretation on the war might be much more difficult than you mentioned it in a kind of capitalist surrounding world. So what I want to explain is that the narrative, the German narrative of the Second World War, of the Holocaust, and on the other hand, the Russian narrative, the former Soviet Union narrative, on the so-called Großer Vaterländischer Krieg, the big Patriot War in this conflict, is a major term in the societies of Germany and Russia and the Ukraine. And I think my interpretation has nothing to do, it's not connected with capitalism or with economy or something like that. It has something to do with all that, but it's much more a kind of national consciousness which organized this and legitimate this war, which what is going on in the Ukraine. So that is my background, the background of my talk. I try to read and talk a little bit free then. The European and Russia, and especially the German narrative of the Second World War and the Holocaust, is a central element of the national historical consciousness. Both the justification and Putin's real historical approach are very similar to the situation around 1938. You know, the appeasement politics between Stalin and Hitler. But both Russia's aggression against Ukraine represent a breach of all international laws we know. What is quite important in the discussion of national self-defense for the Ukraine and the military support of Europe and Germany is whether, and that is a kind of interpretation, is it a war of aggression from Russia or a war of defense from the Ukrainian side? And that makes a difference for the international law at all, because we have the Article 50 in the UN Charter, who said that if a nation is aggressive is an aggression against the nation and a war is against this nation, you have the right to defend yourself. That you can read in Charter, in Article 15 of the UN Charter. So, of course, the fascism of the Hitler regime on one hand, and now I speak from the fascism and not from the Holocaust. That's different, you know. The Russia wage of war aggression have similarities. But what we have now in Germany is the discussion, what have we learned from the past? No war, never again, or dealing with the war if that war itself is illegitimate and a criminal kind of aggression, like we found it here and there in Russia, I guess. So that is a situation in Germany right now. Is it a dealing with a war which is like Michael Walzer wrote his book? Is it a just war, or is it an unjust war who is going on here? A just war from the Ukraine to defend themselves, or is it an unjust war? It has to be stopped right now. And the discussion in Germany between right and left is pretty similar. And that makes me very nervous. And I think if this argumentation between right-wing and left-wing people or organizations like Die Linke in Germany and Sarah Wagenknecht and some others, representatives of Die Linke, and on the other hand, Alice Weidel, representative of the AfD, they are so similar. So I have to prove what is the reason for that they have on the right-wing argumentation almost the same arguments like on the left-wing argumentations. I have to prove it as a political scientist and as a socialist. So that is one point. And it's totally clear that the aggression from Russia against Ukraine is absolutely a violation of all international laws. But what exactly does that mean in the discussion if, for example, we have it here in Germany to give more weapons for defense to the Ukraine, and on the other hand, to go into dialogue with Putin and to stop the war? What does it mean in Germany? Putin is not willing to discuss, to go into a dialogue. That is a result of the last half a year. And it's much more than half a year. You know that the Crimea War in 2014, it starts. So we have the similar situation in the Chechenian Krieg, the Chechenian War. We have Putin's reaction in Syria, and nobody was standing up against him, or only a few, maybe NGOs, organizations who are standing up against him. So, in other words, what was fixed in international law as the lessons of the Second World War, not only for Europe, and was also firmly written in the UN Charter, that violates now the integrity of the Ukraine. To go into a dialogue with Putin is much more, it's an illusion. Putin's intention is to destroy the Ukraine as a nation, as an autonomous political system, as a cultural society. It's a kind of extermination of a nation, of culture, of talk. I traveled to former UdSSR, the Russia, in 1992 when the Soviet Union broke down. I was in Armenia. In Georgia was war. In Armenia was war. Nagorno-Karabakh was war with Azerbaijan. And still we have a lot of positive nation-building systems in the former UdSSR. That was, for example, the Ukraine. That was, for example, the Baltic states, Litauen, Letland, Estland. So a lot of positive things were going on. That means for Putin, and Gorbachev died, you know, some days ago, some weeks ago, but that means for Putin, if this former imperial system of the former Soviet Union is now going away, and they have no influence on it. So what does it mean? And his idea is go back to the Tsaristic, to the territory of Peter den Großen. That is his idea. He and the Russian political institution and the old communists are still traumatized from the breakdown of the empire, of the Soviet empire. And that is a background in the political system of Putin. So because this former leaders of the communist state of the former UdSSR, they cannot accept what, for example, Gorbachev did with the former Soviet Union. They will never let him go into a history book or something like that. On the one hand, this is the one point, and on the other hand, what Putin does very well is to use the term of Nazism, of National Socialism, Nazism, as an argument for the Russian people. Most of the Russian people know exactly, because it was every year we have this day of the Große Vaterländische Krieg in May. Everybody knows it's a national narrative, and everybody knows in the former UdSSR, Russia now, what does it mean to fight against Nazism? And Russia's argument that the Ukraine is dominated by Nazism, that is a background feeling for him inside Russia, because they know exactly they lost a lot of people during World War II, and they fight against Nazism. And now Putin's argument into Russia is we do the same against Ukraine. That is, so we have 2 points. One is from outside, that means the breakdown of the Soviet empire, and one is in the inside, that means fight Nazism in Russia, in the Ukraine, is a legitimation for Putin on the one hand, or 1.1 legitimation for Putin to for the war. And I will go, I don't know how many times I have. So in the past decades, Ukraine has consistently pursued the path of democratization of society. The creation of modern institutions and the moral and spiritual renewal of Ukrainian society. We have a lot of NGOs. We had after the Maidan in 2013, there was a lot of new nation building process in the civil society in the Ukraine. It was a good way, and of course, the point for the Ukraine to go to the West, to go maybe in the European Union, to go maybe on the NATO, that was a decision and a discussion in the parliament of the Ukraine. It has nothing to do with a legitimate argument from Putin. So, of course, the nation building of the Ukraine in the last years had a lot of contradictions. For example, on the Maidan, we had the so-called right sector. There was a group organization of right-wing politicians, of right-wing organization who came to power. That is a normal fight. It was a contradiction in this nation-building process at the beginning in the Ukraine. The return of totalitarianism in Russia, the destruction of democracy in the Ukraine, and renewed imperial expansion have challenged the spirit of openness of the 90s. The Ukrainians feel this very early on, much earlier than the most European countries, much earlier than the Social Democrats in Germany, much more earlier than Angela Merkel did it with her pipelines and so on. But the Ukrainian, they felt it very early. But now most of the politicians say, okay, you have to have a dialogue with Putin. But can they have a dialogue with those who deny the values of freedom and a democratic dialogue? Can you communicate with those who want to destroy you? After 2014, when Russia started the war against Ukraine, when the Crim War and the Donbas war is going on, a lot of sociologists and political analysts ask, can we talk to Putin at the moment when they are killing and destroy you? For them, the answer was pretty clear, no, we can't have a dialogue with him. It is difficult to have a dialogue, even more an argumentative discourse, when you are being shot at and your cities are being bombed since February 24 on 22. Russia started a new phase of its war, and a new area in European history. The maxim never again, in the light of which Europe, and especially Germany, its history after 1945, now crave way to the Russian maxim, we can do it again. We can do it again means we can fight against nationalism, against Nazism. We can do it again. The destruction of entire cities, Mariupol, Irpin, Hostomel, Borodyansk, and districts like Charkiv, Chernihiv, the murder of tens and of thousands of people, rocket attacks on peaceful cities, torture, rape, the execution of civilians, the genocidal acts and war crimes committed by the Russians in towns near Kiev and around and in the east, which they are now continuing in the south and east of the country, signify the return of new aggression. This has returned precisely because it has never been truly condemned, because it has not suffered a real defeat, unlike German Nazism or Italian fascism. I mean, it has not truly condemned means that no aggression from Russia, from the former Soviet Union, was really condemned. It doesn't matter if it was Hungary in 1953, it was Prague Spring in 1968, it was Poland in 1989. So because most of the people who were with the former UdSSR think that communist ideas are still an alternative to capitalism and to the Western system. And this were, the speaker mentioned before, this idea, the logic of the Cold World War, most of the critics people, the socialists and others, they were trapped into this side, stay on the American side, anti-Americanism, or stay on the Russian or the communist side, or to be an anti-communist. But it was not discussed enough which faults were made in the system of the former Soviet Union. Unlike German Nazism and Italian fascism, Russian imperial practices were more inhuman and cruel policies by Ivan and the cruel policies from Ivan the Terrible or to Stalin, but have never been punished by the world like it was in the Nuremberg trials in 1945. Therefore, today we see the reproduction of these practices with renewed vigor. Today, the Ukrainian people resolutely repeal aggression and defeat their freedom. But they are not only defending the freedom of the Ukrainian people. Our national liberation struggle against Russia is also a fight for freedom in Europe, for a free civil society which defends human rights and humanity, and a political system of maybe a democratic civil society with much more tolerance, like we have at right now in the democratic system. That is an argument from some.
Well, you have another 3 minutes. You are coming to an end.
Okay. That is an argument of a lot of politicians and scientists in the Ukraine right now. Okay, I will come to my last point. So I spoke about that we never really spoke about the faults in this communist system, in this Marxist system. And that has a pregnant story and a pregnant situation found in the 68ers. I will come to this last point. All 68ers, ex-communists and other do-gooders where passion can sing a song about this, precisely because their ideological sidelines were even more massive. Whole libraries and renegade literature from the 30s and 40s of the 20th century are filled with accounts of the pangs of conscious and political ballads that befell ardent communists when they learned of Stalin's crimes. One had to witness how even in the resistance against Hitler and in the fight against General Franco's Spanish Falangist Guard, unreliable comrades of the international brigades disappeared, never to be seen again, or were liquidated on the spot. Quote, I was 26 years old when I joined the Communist Party and 33 when I left it. Arthur Koestler wrote it in his memories. It is about the years between 1931 and 1938 when he also wrote his Spanish Testament. Never before, quote, never before or since did life seem so overflowing with meaning as during those 7 years. They had a superiority of beautiful error over sordid truths. And it was not only the state leaders, it was also opposition from the former United States, like Angela Davis, who were asked, for example, from Solzhenitsyn, who was in the Gulag, when Angela Davis visited Europe, the former UdSSR and Prague in 1972, and Solzhenitsyn asked her to say something for the dissidents, but Angela Davis was not able to speak for the dissidents, and she knows why exactly. I quote from a historian from the former GSSR, it was not only the state leaders who tried to win Angela Davis over. The artists who were oppressed by the dictatorships in the East also hoped for support. But there were few points of contact between Davis and civil rights activists and activists in the East. Opposition cultural figures in the former Eastern Bloc, such as writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn, criticized David's lack of solidarity. And last quote, and then I finish. At stake was not only her life, David's life, but also the struggle for the Black civil movement. She needed another meta level beyond the context of racism, and that was communism. And in the context, she thought that she could then better achieve her goals for the Black community. She realized who could support her, not dissidents, not oppositional artists, but the state powers. She became willing to compromise and sacrifice her image for her goal. And that means that a lot of German leftists and German communists do this kind of collaboration with the faults of the communist repression system from the former Soviet Union. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think that was a perspective raising extremely challenging questions, very, very worthwhile questions. And I can assure you that we are all, these three, and I think all the members of the Creative Theory Colloquium are committed to human rights, committed to democracy, and committed to socialism. Most of us are also. So even when we, well, I will not speak more just now, because I think we have another 15 minutes. We should take up questions, but would the panelists, the first two panelists, or the panelists themselves take a minute or two each to respond before we go further? Or what does Rityusha recommend? We straight go to the open questions?
Sir, I think we can take the panelists on board in terms of responding to each other first, and then maybe...
Okay. Now, is that okay? Achin, Anuradha, and then Peter again. 2 minutes each, because three of you had very important formulations, and they demanded more discussions from each other. Achin.
All right. My presentation was more general. I think both Anu and Peter focused much more on the Ukraine-Russian war. Let me just say something about the Ukraine-Russian war here. The left has been divided on this. Question number one, is there a geopolitical dimension of this war? The answer to that is yes, obviously. Right? Is there a particular dimension concerning Putin and Russia's ambitions, expansionist ambitions? The answer to that is yes. The question then becomes for the left, which is the more important dimension? Which is the one in which you're going to give greater explanatory weight in order to understand that over here? So you have a large number of people who say that, of course, we condemn it and it's wrong, etc. But you have to understand about what NATO is doing, blah, 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 etc. Fine. And of course, NATO is the most powerful of the other side. The other side says, in fact, in this particular case, please understand that the most important factor, explanatory factor is not the question of NATO. And I can go on about that over here, even as we're opposed to it, etc. But in fact, the ambitions of the Putin regime, which, as Peter talked about, are much interrelated. The whole question of wanting to end even Ukraine's existence is separate, a kind of greater Russian chauvinism. And it's very interesting because he's an anti-communist, very much there. He rejects Lenin's right to self-determination and attacks them and wants to do that. So in fact, the divide is intimately related to how much weight one gives to one over the other. As for the question of Russia being an imperialist country is obvious, and it also has its own alliance structure, which is the CSTO. And which is, of course, an alliance structure between a much more powerful country, Russia, and the others, which involves, in fact, even the help at the military level. And just 1.5 months before the invasion of Ukraine, you had the Russians sending troops to help a dictator in Kazakhstan to put down the repression over there. Let's not forget these realities. And as for Russia being threatened, it's the largest nuclear weapon. It has a much powerful military. And you have real problems even with the extension of NATO to Ukraine. But anyway, that's a separate issue over here. As for India, and I use the word aspiring imperialist powers, and of course the question is, what is an imperialist power? Does not an imperialist power also operate in a certain way economically? Does it seek to establish a hegemonic relationship in its own areas, etc.? Does it intervene militarily in other places, except outside of its own territory? And in fact, India has done that. Whether you're talking about 1988, going into a civil war in Maldives to establish itself, whether you're talking about the takeover of a protected Sikkim, whether you're talking about how it bullies Bhutan, which actually is prepared to go ahead with a kind of land deal with the Chinese, which would be quite generous to it. But of course, it's not allowed to it. And you have all kinds of other aspects about the Indian behavior. Turkey, same thing, whether you talk about Azerbaijan against the Kurds, this, that, etc. Pakistan, Afghanistan, all of these things here. The last part, which I just want to end with, is that when I talked about those 5 evils, 4 of them are intimately connected to capitalism. The nuclear question is a little bit separate. You can be here, but 4 of them are connected to that. If we want to really move towards a much more humane order to address these problems, we have to be anti-capitalist, but we're dealing with governments everywhere which are capitalist, including in the global south, and which are much more preoccupied not with addressing these particular problems, but by pursuing what they see very narrowly as their interests, security interests in realist, neo-realist terms, which we must understand to understand their behavior. But the crucial question is, what is our position going to be? Are we going to rationalize and justify the game's lefts are evil, this, that, etc.? Or are we going to put our efforts, however difficult it is, to trying to generate the kind of consciousness which recognizes that all of these bunch in greater or lesser level, stronger or weaker level, have to be opposed in various ways. And they have to move in the direction of a greater moral and political integrity, an anti-capitalist perspective. And you do not promote capitalism by operating only within or primarily within a realist or neo-realist way. I'll stop you.
Thank you. Anu?
Yeah, the only thing I want to say is that, these are all 3 different perspectives, and there's probably an element of truth in all of them. But I said, sort of question examining Putin's psychological ambitions, etc. Because till 2019, I didn't see any research or scholarship actually talking about all this. This has just come after the war, that he has these ambitions, etc. And it, for me, it doesn't, maybe he does, but it doesn't make sense why he would want to have within this sort of so far controllable Russian empire, a people who would be constantly having, a war against, because this is going to be an endless war. And if he actually absorbed Ukraine, which I don't think was the initial motive, you would have a most troubled region forever. The Russian state would collapse even without external intervention. Right now, it can collapse because of the forces allied against it. But I don't see how any state, like, for example, India could have ambitions. Can it take Pakistan back into a larger India, as some people on the right, kind of propagate? I don't think that is rational. So to look for rational evidence, I kind of look at documents and speeches. And here, what I've seen is a repeated interest in collaboration, accommodation, or peaceful coexistence within capitalism. But right now, all that is under threat. So one has to see what one's priorities are.
Okay.
Because I see this as an endless kind of conflict, really.
Okay, Peter?
Yeah, what is bothering me in this discussion, maybe it's a typical European or German discussion, which is going on right now. So you have on one hand, the left was defending national buildings developments in the colonial system. It was very necessary that, for example, Algeria, Frantz Fanon, other people who were defending a nation building and to go away from colonialist states like, for example, France and Holland and Latin America, Nicaragua, for example. When the fight was going on in Nicaragua to free Nicaragua, the left in Germany, they collected money to give weapons to the revolutions in Nicaragua. And now we have a lot of leftists who are now saying, okay, no, we can't give weapons to the Ukraine. Why not? You did it before. It's a kind of nation building. They are hoping that they can defend and to save their lives and to save the nation. That is one point. What really makes me confused is the arguments between the right and the left here. And all my efforts in this situation, and I'm pretty much involved since the 24th of February in the Ukrainian peace movement. And my effort is to figure out what is in our idea from an alternative society, another society, in this Marxist system, in the communist system, basically wrong. Something must be basically wrong. A lot of nations in the South, they, for example, people say, NGOs and others, they say, good to have the human rights. Here in Germany or in Europe, the leftists say, no, the human rights are just appendix from the USSR, from the UN and the NATO. We don't know what a democratic system might be, a real democratic system might be for a kind of socialist society.
All right.
We don't know. And one last point.
Yeah.
And for me, it's a very I can't understand why the left, why Marxists, why Marcusians don't work on the Prague Spring idea of a socialism with a human face. What does that mean? We never took this idea again. Only a few people took this again and tried to figure out what does that mean?
Yeah.
What was that idea in the Prague Spring? Thank you very much. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Dhananjay, you begin the question. You have it in the chat box, but you can speak. Dhananjay.
1 second, sir. Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is interesting. I think we got three perspectives to imperialism, to critique of imperialism, then to equating USSR and Russia with Nazism. But this is to Professor Jansen. Can we discuss entire development outside capitalism? I mean, can we have one way of narrative to depict it, to understand USSR and Russia? It seems that, I mean, can we discuss entire development outside capitalism? It seems that USSR, Russia is lone force operating independently. I think rejection of Putin must also invite rejection of capitalism or capitalist-led imperialism in the present context. Thank you.
Yeah, let's take more questions. Yeah.
May I answer it or not?
No, just wait. Kindly wait, because we have only a few minutes left. Yeah. Any other questions?
Lauren.
All right. Okay, Peter, you can answer that question. But
Okay,
I thought you had already, in a way, you had already implied your answer, but you can state it. Yes.
I saw Lauren was. Lauren, do you want to?
Yeah, you can respond to that.
There's a misunderstanding. I can respond to this question. Putin. Yes. Okay. So yes, okay. For me and my discussion and view on this conflict, it is not the focus of the alternative Putin and capitalism and imperialism. It's not my focus. My focus is another one. My focus is have a nation a legitimate reason to fight against an enemy and to ask for support when an aggression war is going on.
Okay.
That is one point.
Yeah.
And another point is, in my opinion, we must find much more universal ethical standards like the human rights to make concrete what we want to have as another society.
Absolutely.
Can I?
Okay.
Perhaps
Lauren, do you have?
Can I perhaps address this question, which is?
No, just wait, Achin, one second. Lauren, did you want to raise a question? Lauren.
Well, not so much a question, but a series of comments that begin with, for the folks, most of the folks here don't know me because I'm over on the other side of the world right now. I was one of the founding members of the Marxist section of the American Sociological Association. I also started the Global Studies, with some other people, the Global Studies Association, which is the largest organization of people that do globalization research. Okay, I want to just basically, from a slightly different perspective, strongly support what Peter was saying. And I'm always amazed, I find it amazing of how many people in the third world who've never been to Europe, let alone Ukraine, have a very, very strong opinion based on no knowledge of the history, going back to the Stalin starvation of the Ukrainian people in the 1930s, et cetera, et cetera. How many people have actually talked with any of the Marxists, especially the Marxist feminists in Ukraine? How many people know Ukrainian people? How many people know much of the history? Now, let me just get up on, because I could talk for an hour, but I won't. Fortunately for you. About 15 years ago, I was in Paris at the Sorbonne at a dissertation hearing of a woman. I'll give you her name. Her name is Vera Nikolsky. She was born in Russia, educated in France. She did her dissertation on Alexander Dugin. And if anybody doesn't know who he is, he's sort of the intellectual brains behind Putin, although they don't have much of a strong personal relationship. Anyhow, to summarize a very, very complex dissertation based on interviews with a large number of Russians and Putin himself and Dugin himself. Dugin saw the vision of the Soviet Union and then the post-Soviet Union as the restoration of the empire of Alexander the Great, a pan-Slavic empire of white Christians to defend against the mongrelization of the race, to defend against the growing number of LGBT, against the power of women, and etc., etc. Now, in Russia, we have a bastard kind of communism, socialism. I don't know what the hell you would call it. I'll leave it up to the brighter people than myself to label it. But you had a situation where after the fall, there was a strong segment of the population, Putin was part of that, of the Russian state instruments of violence, namely the military and the KGB, now the FSB, that despised, hated, and loathed the inevitable breakup of the Soviet Union. This was really clear when Putin couldn't even attend the funeral of Gorbachev, because he hated Gorbachev, he hated Yeltsin for the dismantling of the sclerotic Soviet empire or Soviet Union or empire that lasted far too long. Okay, the point here is that if you look at at Putin's website, not a preconceived notion of the evils of capitalism I know all too well. If you look at what Putin has said, he wanted to restore the empire and thought he could get away with it, just as he did in Crimea, just as he did in Chechen, just as he's done in Syria, etc., etc. But he didn't count on the agency of the people in Ukraine that Peter so beautifully taught. They did not want to be part of the Soviet Union. They did not want Russian domination any more than the Poles want Russian domination. I've been to Poland. Any more than the Czechs wanted Russian domination. I've been there too. Any more than Estonians. I have been there as well, because I do globalization research, that anybody that's been under the domination of Russia did not want Russian domination. And they asserted their agency. And that is why it is not a war that doesn't have an end, because if anybody just paid attention this morning, the military, the Ukrainian military is basically cut off Kherson, and about 20,000 Russian soldiers are either going to swim across the river, die of starvation, or surrender. And when that happens, there may very well be, I'm not making a prediction, there may very well be a coup to get rid of Putin because of all the damage that he's caused.
Okay, Lebron. Yeah.
I could go on, but I won't.
Okay. You wanted to say something more, or is that okay?
I could go on, but I won't. Charles.
Okay, thank you. Any other question?
Well, I would also like to
Charles,
make a comment.
Yeah.
My comment is just that I so appreciated the tremendous clarity of the presentations here to help us generate this kind of breakthrough against the war. You know, that I do think that this panel has been extremely helpful in understanding the context of the Ukrainian situation. And so our colleagues in India, as well as Peter Ervin, thank you very much. I wanted to make a suggestion. There was, Peter Ervin asked, well, with what sort of a system are we going to oppose the imperialism of the USA or the nationalism of Russia today? And I want to just mention quickly that Herbert Marcuse had the notion that we needed to undertake a system negation of both of those social formations, a system negation that can become a new general interest and that would be grounded in a kind of eco-socialism, as has been hinted at here, as well as from Peter Ervin's side, the socialism with the human face. But I want to remind Peter that there's a lot of collaboration with the brutal and grotesque policies of the United States, and that we as USers have the responsibility to hold the U.S. accountable for its genocidal and ecocidal policies. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other comment? Thank you. Any other question? Yes. Yes. Yes, please, Vasudha. Yeah.
Sujata.
Sujata. Yes, please. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you all for a very clear and wonderful presentation. I mean, your perspectives came out very clearly, and it was also very informative. I have two questions, one for the first two speakers and one for Peter in the end. Both of you mentioned about nuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction, and their role in the war. Do you think that WMDs are instrumental in an otherwise geopolitical conflict, or they are intrinsic to the or germane to war itself? I mean, do you think the lobby, WMD lobby, would play a role in these in the emergence of such wars, or it is purely geopolitical? These are merely instruments. How do you place them in this? That's the question. And as far as Peter is concerned, I just wanted to say that from the human rights perspective, the NATO's invasion of Iraq and decimation and pulling down of Saddam Hussein in the name, that there are weapons of mass destruction there, and till the end, none of the NATO European countries nor America could be held accountable for the gross violations of human rights. They just went and decimated a country after World War. I mean, and then Vietnam, of course, I don't even. So if we are talking about let us, if we leave alone capitalism and socialism, if we are talking just about human rights, I would consider the United States as the only, I mean, one country that constantly perpetuates direct and indirect wars in every part of the world. So, I mean, Iraq, for instance. So, how would you respond to that?
Any other question? We have already gone beyond our time limit.
I just have one small question.
Yes, please, Savita.
Can we, in the international arena, use human rights perspective and UN perspective to explain incidents of war that is happening at the moment? Is it sufficient to explain the complexity of invasion of Ukraine by Russia?
Okay, all right. Any other comment or question? Well, okay, I have a question to the panel. Has Europe and the West re-emerged as the decisive world forces, not only developing capitalism into a new stage, but also facing the challenge of the rise of the global South as challengers seeking to democratize the world. So in the process now we have the emerging world of competing hegemonies. Europe and America challenged by Russia and China. That is my common question to all three of you. Okay, can we now go back to the panel? Yes, Achin?
Yeah, but what was the last point that you ended up your last two sentences?
My last point was that the re-emergence of Europe and the West as leading capitalist forces in the world at a time when global South was rising and seeking to democratize the global political economy. And now in this process, we are seeing a world of competing hegemonies. You call them competing imperialisms. I'm calling them competing hegemonies. US hegemony together with the European continent, and Russia and China as also hegemons, challenging US-led hegemony.
Okay, to take your question first, of course, is that insofar,
Okay.
sorry, as insofar as all these powers, especially the major powers, are capitalist powers. You only have two outliers, North Korea and Cuba. Leave them aside. They have a common interest in wanting to establish the order by which all of these capitalist countries and their transnational corporations can benefit on the global scale. And that, of course, means a constitutionalization of a capitalist system through the WTO, through the IMF. And here it is a subset of the most powerful entities that has the biggest responsibility to try to stabilize the situation globally, which means the United States, Europe, Russia, China, and even you could think of a country like India, which is also going to later on, and Japan, of course, I should also mention, right? You have this over here. But as you have said, that there are competing hegemonies, capitalist hegemonies, because what happens is that even as they all want to accept competition, when they lose out, they don't want to lose out. And then there are other reasons which don't have so much to do with capitalism, but have to do with history, territorial, this, that, etc. But also, like I pointed out about EZs and all that, they're also fighting with each other. And here, of course, the biggest problem now is really Russia, China, and the US. The EU, which you talk about, is basically an economic giant, with Germany being the most important, but politically and military, something of a midget. After the Ukraine war, you have other countries now reinforcing NATO. And of course, Putin knew that, so that was no bother for him. But you also have Germany, which could push US control over Europe politically, militarily, could push it in that direction. At the same time, Germany has made $100 billion worth in terms of its defense. And there will be German ambitions to become more independent and powerful, but I don't know where this is going to go. For the time being, this is the situation there. With regard to the question on, I think, Savita, with regard to the question of human rights, that issue here. Human rights doesn't really shape the global order. We all know that. But the discourse on human rights and the effort of human rights is to bring the question of morality and to try to use this to raise awareness. And to, of course, insofar as people tend to believe in their own governments and also tend to believe in democracy or human rights, you can try to expose the hypocrisies of these in these countries among people. And by doing so, generate a greater awareness of a much more collective international need to fight for a much more humane order, which of course means seeking to transcend capitalism. At least that's the version that comes from the left. From the liberals, it's that we have to reform capitalism and we have to reform democracy. And that is it there. The point about weapons of mass destruction, and your point was about, well, why do countries go in for nuclear weapons? They go in for nuclear weapons for three reasons. One, changes in threat perception. Second, changes in self-perception. Third, the assumption that having nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction will strengthen their foreign policy. So it's related to geopolitics and interstate security matters, right? All countries say it's because of threat, but that's not correct. The United States was the first country did it for self-perception. We have to be dominant. The Russians and the Chinese did it much more for threat perceptions, right? The Americans have it, we the Russians have to have it. The Chinese say we have to have it because the Russians have it and the Americans have it, China's have it, right? Britain and France, self-perception. Declining colonial powers, we must become at the high table. India, much more for self-perception. Pakistan, much more related threat perception. All of them they have, right? Now, the interesting thing is that this is the most powerful military weapon. It's supposed to give you enormous strength. But there is a huge problem in translating this, even though all of them, your bloody Jay Shankars and your others and all the rest of them talk about using our nuclear weapons and our weapons of mass destruction to be able to enhance our security through our foreign policy. But the problem with nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction, and nuclear weapons distinction, because at least you've got international laws and conventions on the other weapons of mass destruction. In the case of nuclear weapons, the threat is so extreme that it's not fungible. What does that mean? It means the threat is so extreme that you can't use it to get benefits in your foreign policy. Are you going to use your nuclear weapons?
We have unleashed the most important mind on this question. So please stop it.
Not only that, the most interesting thing is, this is the most military powerful force, but you know, nuclear weapons countries have lost wars to non-nuclear countries.
Okay.
I just want to end here because this is a very important point here. Vietnam defeats the United States. The Russians have to get out of Afghanistan. The French have to get out of Algeria. Britain can't do anything about Suez. What is India bloody going to do with these nuclear weapons? Except probably have a war. Now, why is it that you have this? And this is where the question of Savita about human rights and all comes in.
Yeah.
The biggest barrier towards the use by nuclear weapons by nuclear weapons countries which have thought of using it sometime has been the moral taboo.
Yeah.
Even countries in the United States where the majority population says a majority we should have weapons, they say it's horrible to use them. Yeah. And that question of the nuclear taboo has been so powerful that countries with nuclear weapons have even prepared to accept loss and political defeats, etc. And that is intimately related to the question of raising awareness about the question of human decency and human rights and all that. So that is one area in which you could say that the question of human rights and all has played a crucial role. And if the Dhananjay's last point, quickly point about his question about Russia, I got the impression that he seemed to think that Russia today is not a capitalist country or an imperialist country, and that it is lone independent. But the oligarchs of Russia are different from the oligarchs in China. Most of them have their monies outside. They have huge investments outside.
But what does it mean?
Global international.
Okay.
What is the argument?
But of course, they have the other problems.
So they are capitalists. Yeah.
Obviously.
Okay. Now, Anu, please, your concluding words.
Sorry.
What Savita said, can we use a human rights perspective in IR? I think we should have a human rights, a human security, and a human development perspective. But sadly, states, number one, sometimes actually use it and misuse it and delegitimize these perspectives. For example, they use it for one state and they say that they're going to do humanitarian intervention or liberal intervention or bring democracy to Nicaragua or etc. So they delegitimize these perspectives themselves. But nonetheless, the fact of this human rights, this moral taboo, the nuclear taboo, etc. I think these can gradually, through the force of ideas, extend to an overall war taboo. That war itself is as bad as using a nuclear weapon in terms of its length and its destructive nature and the kind of impact it has, not just for one generation, but 3 or 4 generations. So we have to still pursue that. And I agree with what Professor Mohanty said about, in a sense, whether Europe is re-emerging as a decisive force. At least they're trying to, but I think it's a bit late for them. There are forces in the global south which are probably authoritarian, imperialist, or whatever you want to call them, but they are challenging and finding ways to bypass Europe, whether economically, geopolitically, and so forth. Thank you.
Peter, last words.
Yeah, it's very interesting for me to hear that you criticize human rights violations with the argument of human rights. And it's very interesting. Every human rights violation, you use human rights as a legitimation to say that is a violation. So my point here is, what is the ethical, the moral base on which a new kind of society will have a foundation? And after that, and about a democratization, maybe we are an autonomous country, nation, group who can decide which kind of economy we want to have in our society. So for me, the question on which kind of democratic establishment, democratic organization, democratic system. How can we make decisions in a community? What is the right way to make decisions in a community? It's much more interesting and then to criticize right now the capitalist system. I'm sorry, maybe I'm not a Marxist, but for me, really the ethical foundation is much more interesting. And why should we have, it's an autonomous decision to have a capitalist economy, okay, that's fine. If the people have a profit from that, it's fine. Then we have a capitalist system. If the people are satisfied with it, and if we can control it, and it's no surplus and something like that. That is a kind of organization. What we do. Just one last point. The human rights, we have a lot of sociologists research about the aggression from Putin since the Chechenian war here in Europe. It was Chechenian, it was Georgia, Abkhazia, it was Nagorno-Karabakh, and we have a lot of interesting research on that. And it was the war in Ukraine was not the first one. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think it has been a most fascinating discussion, and I hope we are all together contributing to the cause of peace, democracy, and disarmament, and democratization of the global political economy. Thank you all very much. Ritusa, you want to say something?
She's gone now, isn't she?
Ritusa, you want to conclude, or who is our? Yeah.
Sir, please go ahead. I think chair's remarks are the concluding remarks.
No. Now there is no time for chair's remarks. You can conclude now. Yeah.
Sir, I'll request you to conclude in that case.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much. I think we had a wonderful session, and we will remember these arguments.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for
Thank you very
coming.
much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, Peter. We are all hoping for similar values.
Yeah. I was very happy to see you, Achin. I
Okay.
wish you all the best. Be well.